This has no news to you, but this has been a challenging week. This sermon will be a little disjointed because of it. I wanted to start with a couple of things that perhaps will tie into the gospel text, and perhaps you'll go home not seeing how it was tied in and then let me know how it was tied into the sermon. I want to start out in Texas. This last week, as you're well aware, a horrific event, which we as Americans seem to be good at, happened in the United States, unique to our nation, the frequency of these kinds of issues. Other nations have had issues, and adults sit down and say, we don't want this to happen anymore, we should change things, and then things don't happen anymore. But we seem to not do that. There was a theologian this last week that said something that I thought was helpful. Hard, but helpful. Miroslav Volf, who is a Slovakian Protestant theologian who teaches at Yale, said that it is deeply hypocritical to pray for things that we don't intend to resolve, which I thought was an interesting phrase. There was another thing that happened this last week that has been exciting. If you missed the announcements, on Friday, 2 days ago, our presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, our national bishop, asked publicly for the resignation of our own Sierra Pacific Synod bishop, Megan Rohr. This is tied in part to events that happened last December in the firing of a Latino pastor in a Spanish-language New Start congregation in Stockton. It is not the kind of thing that lends itself well to bumper stickers or 140 characters in your Twitter feed. There seems to be a strong desire to simplify things into a very binary situation that are extremely, extremely complex. And that's really hard. Now, that right up against the excitement of going back to our first real Senate Assembly this week, that is suddenly now very, very exceptionally interesting as we move towards it. I think in many cases there are very well-meaning people for whom things did not go as intended. There are challenging, hurtful things that happened that I don't think was anyone's desire when they got up out of bed on any given morning, but there are a lot of hurt folks. I was thinking about this as I was reading the news just yesterday about a fire. Some of you, maybe a lot of you, follow New Mexico news really closely, but they are in the thick, 47% contained, of the largest wildfire in state history. 300 homes burned to the ground, thousands of people being evacuated, in some cases on more than one occasion. Have you heard about this? Did you hear how it started? It was an intentional prescribed burn by the National Forest Service. They got away from them. It was a prescribed burn in January. That it died down, was out, controlled. This is healthy. It's a good thing to do. Just a little fire here, right? Keep it contained. We know how this works, right? 3 months later, the fire comes back, jumps the lines, and is wreaking havoc everywhere. When I think of our Senate news in particular, I think of well-meaning intentions, difficult things, hurtful things in some cases, some mistakes being made, some issues that are horrifically, culturally insensitive, perhaps, at times, very hard things. So I'll leave those fun things parked with you for a second, and then we'll move to our text. One of the things that I love about this season is that our first readings, which normally come from the Old Testament, come from the book of Acts. And often in the book of Acts, we get these great stories. And we got another one of those today. We get verses and verses and verses of this story. So Paul and his stunt double, Silas, roll into town. They are ready to share the good news of Jesus Christ in this community, and they are setting up and doing just that. But there's a glitch. There's a glitch in the plan. The glitch is there's this girl who follows them around everywhere they go, saying, I know who you are. I know what you're about. And I love in the text, it says, after several days of this, Paul says, okay, that's it. Now, this becomes a big deal because this girl had a spirit of divination. She would tell fortunes, all kinds of things. She was a slave as well. She made money not for herself, but for her master. Paul turns around, casts out the spirit of divination, which I'm sure was perhaps great for the girl, but the master, not so excited. Paul is dragged to the marketplace. He and Silas are thrown in prison. Now, I don't know what prison was like in first century Mediterranean. I'm not picturing it being super pleasant. Sounds like there were beatings to be had, any number of things. But when we think about this context, it's interesting to me that we get this complete side story to the conveying of the gospel. It's not even really central to what's happening. But there is a piece of this that I think speaks to our context. We're all seeking to move through this life with some sense of grace, with some sense of love and hope, and yet continually it feels like there are hands on us. Maybe sometimes literally it feels like there are hands on us. So I think of little ones. But when I think of how we're often just dragged down by this life, the news of this week, Paul walking through the marketplace, all kinds of things that crop up when we're just trying to get from calendar item 1 to calendar item 2 to calendar item 3, and we're just not going to make it. Paul finally gets frustrated with this girl. But you can imagine any number of things that might frustrate us as we go through this life. In any given week, it may be the same thing or it may be a new thing. It is the kind of thing that rises up and maybe isn't overwhelming on its own, but that great expression, being pecked to death by ducks, right? This sense of endless wearing us down. And where does it end up with Paul and Silas? It ends up in prison. Now, in prison is the end of the story, typically. It would be, well, that was fun. And in our own sense, in our own lives, when we go to the movies, and you're only halfway through the story, and the hero ends up in prison, is the remaining 60 minutes of it kind of fast-forwarding through the 40 remaining years of their life in the prison cell? No, there's always something dramatic, right? It's the stunt double, Silas, who didn't end up in the cell, who breaks in and steals the keys and lets somebody out. But that's not what happens here. Paul and Silas are in some ways without help. The whole squad is in the jail. There's nobody waiting out at the car to break in and get them out. But it's interesting we read this during the season of Easter. We're now a week of weeks past Easter, as we say that we celebrate a week of weeks, the resurrection. We think of a body put into a tomb that would on Sunday morning be opened and empty. We think of situations where it seems like there is no path forward and no hope. And suddenly, from an unexpected corner, something comes, giving the hope of new life, a way forward, good news to those who are captive, who are bound, who are hurting. In this case, the good news comes as an earthquake. The jail busts apart, they get out, and he converts the jailer and his family, and the whole household is baptized, it says. I think the challenge for us is to not get worn down by this life. We're already worn down by all of the articles about the shooting this last week and the angst related to it, but a first happened yesterday that I saw in the news. Both the Fraternal Order of Police and the Association Nationally of Police Chiefs wrote a letter to Congress asking for progress on gun laws. Do you know how many times that's happened in the history of the United States? It's never happened. It's never happened. What will it do? I don't know. But it's not a corner where we would have necessarily expected something to happen. So when we look at this text today, when we look at the world around us and the lives that we lead as we move through this life, I think the Easter message I would leave with you is in the places where it seems that there is no hope, where you are in a cell that is locked, or where society seems like it cannot move forward, or who knows what the situation might be, a work situation that is difficult, or as we look at our Synod and the wider church, or we think of any number of things that go on in this world and in our lives, that when things seem most bleak, there should be some sense in our heart of the love of God for resurrection that we cannot imagine. In fact, we might say that in this Easter season, we are reminded that our God specializes in dark places, in closed tombs, and in places where we have given up. So as we move through these last hours of this season, be mindful that no matter what may swirl around us, what may cause us to swirl around, that God is with us, and there is always resurrection hope, particularly when we have perhaps lost ours. Amen.